इस महीने के बुक रिव्यू में हम रिव्यू करेंगे जस्ट कीप बाइंग बाय निक मजूली। ये एक ऐसी बुक है जो आपको स्टेप बाय स्टेप कैसे पैसे इन्वेस्ट करते हैं वो सिखाती है। इट्स अ ब्रिलियंट बुक। इनफैक्ट आई वुड से अगर आप साइकोलॉजी ऑफ मनी और जस्ट कीप बाइंग दोनों बुक्स पढ़ेंगे, you wouldn't need any other book for understanding money and how to invest in it. इस वीडियो में मैं निक मजूली, who's the author of Just Keep Buying, उनके साथ एक गुफ्तगू में ये जानने की कोशिश करता हूं कि उनकी इस बुक की तरफ इंस्पिरेशन क्या थी। इस बुक रिव्यू को स्पॉन्सर किया है कुकू एफएम ने, जो हिंदुस्तान का नंबर 1 वर्नाक्युलर ऑडियो प्लेटफॉर्म है। 19 से 25 अक्टूबर के बीच में कुकू एफएम की दिवाली सेल चल रही है, जहां आपको एनुअल प्लान पे 50% ऑफ मिल सकता है इफ यू अप्लाई द कोड Diwali50। यही नहीं, इसके साथ आप पा सकते हैं गाड़ियां, गोल्ड कॉइन्स, वाउचर्स और बहुत सारे और प्राइजेस। डिस्क्रिप्शन और पिन कमेंट में लिंक है फॉर यू टू गेट 50% ऑफ ऑन द दिवाली सेल ऑफ कुकू एफएम। ये दिवाली कामयाबी वाली। आइए निक मजूली से कॉन्वर्सेशन शुरू करते हैं। Welcome to the conversation, Nick. It's such a pleasure to have you, my friend.
Thank you for having me on. I truly appreciate it.
Perfect. I love the book, and as I was saying when we started this conversation, this would be the book that I would want to write for India. And not that you haven't done a great job for the country already in terms of the context, but I wanted to start with understanding what was your motivation to write the book in the first place. You have been writing for a while, but writing a book is a whole new commitment and a whole new chapter. So what drove you to do that?
To be honest, it was COVID. So I live in New York City. And so COVID first hit here in like March 2020. Everyone was talking about flatten the curve. We saw a big spike. We saw it come down. I thought it was over. I was very naive at the time. Like, COVID's done, guys. Then obviously what happened, the rest of the US got it, right? I saw that happen really quickly and I was like, okay, maybe it's not over. But then that curve even came down. I'm like, okay, guys, now it's over, right? And then December 2020 comes along. I see a bigger curve, more cases than ever before. And then I went super pessimistic. Like, we're going to be in this for years. We're going to be like this forever. I kind of got really pessimistic at the time. And so I was like, you know what? This is an opportunity. I need to use it. I didn't really do anything 2020 to capitalize on that. So I said, I have enough material now. I've been writing long enough. I think I can take a lot of my best pieces and kind of organize them into a philosophy and then obviously fill in holes that I hadn't talked about. For example, I hadn't spoken on real estate much ever on the blog. So that's something I added to the book. I didn't talk much about savings rules and things like that. I added that to the book. So I would say 60% of it is old blog posts, which have been kind of, gone over with my editor and everything. And the other 40% is brand new material. So for people that haven't, or have even been reading me for a long time, they'll get a lot of new stuff out of it. So that was kind of the motivation. Just like, I think I have something now and I just need to organize it properly.
That's awesome, man. I think COVID for everything that it brought along has to be credited for the most creative people to come up with the best creativity possible and actually have a reason to share that with the world. So thanks for doing that. And I'm glad that you got that opportunity. I'm curious, since you mentioned 60% of the book is frankly your blog post, and then you had to add in new content as well. Was it harder to go back to your stuff and redo it, reread it, reimagine it, or was it harder to write new content?
It's always harder to come up with new stuff than to take old stuff and just improve upon it. Cause I'm just a better writer now. So I can take an old idea, which was a great idea, and then just frame it differently. For example, almost every chapter in the book, I start with a story of some sort. Cause I know people love stories. It makes it much easier to kind of dive into a concept when we start with the story versus me just jumping into numbers or something right away. So because of that, I took old blog posts and I said, let's add a better story. Let's find a better story we can add to kind of introduce this core idea, right? And so that was a lot of it, was like introducing new things on top of old concepts that I had talked about. So like a lot of the data stuff, the analysis would have been similar, but as I said, the story, it's how do I get people hooked on this? How do I get people to understand it with an analogy that's really simple and easy?
Wonderful. Great. Well, which was the most difficult chapter to write?
Most difficult chapter? I mean, I could talk about, I think buy versus rent. It's the hardest thing because honestly, anytime buy versus rent or taxes, one or the other, because anytime where there's very specific factors that matter, where it's very individualized, like taxes is a very individual decision, right? Like in the United States, at least, which state you live in affects your tax rate. Which city you live in affects your tax rate. Are you married or single? How much income do you have? What are your income sources? all those things affect your tax rate. So when I'm trying to give advice to people, I don't know you, right? So I have to try and give you generalized advice for everything. I can't kind of get down to very specific. So it's really tough to write general advice for things that are very, very specific. So in the case of like buying versus renting, that's very specific to your local market. Like in your local geography, the rental market versus the ownership market, those are going to be very different, right? So understanding how much, when things are very specific, makes it very, very difficult to write about. So I try my best. I try to give you core principles in each of those chapters, but at the end of the day, like you're going to have people, well, what about in this case? Someone will say that. I was like, yeah, I can't write, if I had to write for every single case, the whole book would be about taxes, and that's boring and I don't want to do that. So you have to kind of make, find a balance and see what are the principles that really matter and just focus on those core principles.
That's so relatable. One of my best performing videos on YouTube is a video that I made on buy versus rent a house. And buying a house in India is a very emotional decision. This is frankly nothing to do with investing, real estate, nothing. It's just emotional. And there were so many reactions, just exactly how you would have mentioned, which is like, oh, you're suggesting that one shouldn't buy and one should rent for the longest time and then buy whatever they can. But what about this? But what about this? And I like how you dealt with it, because you kept it objective. You kept it. This is the math of it. This is not the heart of it. This is not the emotion of it. This is how you would argue and then, of course, bring in whatever emotions you have. And I often say that before you take an emotional decision, do the numbers and then bring the emotions in, because the emotions are going to come in eventually.
Of course, yeah. And that's why with that chapter in particular, like I had to simplify it a lot. Like if you really wanted to get into buying versus renting and comparing it financially, you have to look at like, for example, in the book, I say, okay, my grandparents bought this house. Here's how much it was worth after 20 years. And here's how much the S&P 500 grew to. That's not perfect. That's not a perfect example because they still own their house, right? Like, and I didn't include maintenance costs at all, right? So if I included maintenance and then I said, okay, what do they still own in their house? We would have to rent for 30 years if you're, owning the S&P 500 or something. So it's not a perfect analogy. I just wanted to get at it, but you're right. I said ultimately it's a personal decision. This is the biggest financial decision in your life. It's going to be very emotional, very personal. So it's more about when you're ready, and it's less about, whether the numbers are making perfect sense. You're trying to optimize every dollar. So I think that's the takeaway. I think you said the same thing here. So I agree with that.
Yeah, I noticed you mentioned you had to simplify it a lot. And I did have that point of view. What I found really endearing about the book is it's a very empathetic book. What I mean by that is it doesn't assume, and you're a very knowledgeable guy and you have tremendous experience and you know a lot more than what the book suggests. And it would have been intensely hard for you to even take the decision that I want to speak to an audience that's just getting started. It's almost like kindergarten level of how do you even navigate through the entire world of investing. And that meant a lot of things that would be obvious to you, you had to question whether they were obvious to others as well. Was that a part that your writing in the past has helped you with, or was that something that the book stretched you on?
It's a bit of both. So I'm trying to get better at that. Because when you're writing, when I'm writing on my blog, I'm a little bit more technical. I'm a little more assumed knowledge than when you're writing for a more general audience, which I think the Just Keep Buying is. Of course, it's not for, if you don't know what a stock is or something, this book is going to be a little bit too advanced for you. But if you know just the basics of what a stock is, or in the US, if you've heard of what a 401k is, as long as you even know what it is, that's what's helpful. But I think using my editor helps a lot with that. Like, hey, this is assumed knowledge. We should fix this, right? And so it's like you don't know what you already know, right? And so you have to kind of get rid of that issue when you're writing. So I think I'm trying to get better at that when I'm writing certain things, especially when I'm writing like a book or something for a more mass audience. On the blog, I might assume a little bit more things. For example, I use the term drawdown very naturally, but in the book, I think I define it once and then I don't define it again. But on my blog, I'll just say, oh yeah, there's a 10% drawdown, which means we're 10% from an all-time high, which if anyone who's in investing knows drawdown. We say it all the time without thinking about it, right? I don't want to say 10% from an all-time high every single time when I can just say drawdown, right? So it's just stuff like that. You get used to it over time.
Brilliant. Well, one of the questions I often ask authors is, what do you believe is one of the most important parts in the book that may not be so obviously important to readers in the first place?
Yeah, so I think the most important chapter, and my favorite chapter in the book, is chapter 17, which is like how to buy during a crisis. It's this kind of idea of like, what do you do, during a market decline? And I think it's important because right now, I mean, even, US markets are only 10, 11% off their highs. I don't even know what the number is right now, but it's something like that, to maybe 12%. And it's easy to say, just keep buying when markets are going up or when there's just a small dip and they have a quick V recovery like we did in 2020. But it's going to be much harder to say just keep buying when it's been, a decade and stocks have not gone anywhere, at least in terms of just pure price. Maybe with dividends, they probably might still be up. But it's about how do you keep the faith in the toughest of times. And I think that chapter, as great as it is now, I think it's going to add more value. It adds the most value during the darkest of times. And I talk about this and I say hey, you need to be diversified. You can't just have all your money in one market, right? Imagine a Russian stock investor at the beginning of 2022. They lost 80% in a month, right? It's something you got to, as long as you're diversified, and even if you see, markets aren't doing great, over the long term, they tend to perform well. I mean, on average across all of them, and you're going to see growth in your portfolio. So it's the key is kind of keeping the faith. And I think that's what's really important about that chapter.
Fantastic. No, I'm glad you mentioned that. India's witnessing this wave of new investors, which are largely aged between 20 and 25. They've never seen a bear market. They have no idea what it is when markets fall. All that they've seen in the early years of investing is just this euphoric last 2 years with a little bit of shake-up in the last few months. And that's why they have very little understanding of what to do during a crisis. And the crisis will be eventually happening, whether it happens to the extent that it's happened right now or perhaps even worse in the future. And one has to be prepared for that. So I'm glad that you mentioned that as one of the most important ones. On that note, Nick, the book is, and for no fault of yours, the book is written predominantly for an American citizen, somebody who's earning and spending in the US. When you now think of a global audience, and I largely have an audience based out of India, what percentage is the applicability to countries outside of the US? I'd argue that most of the principles remain the same, but I'd love to hear from you directly what you believe is just the natural extension to some other market.
Yeah, so I completely agree with you. I write for the US because that's the main market that I know. It's much harder for me to write about markets where I don't know them as intimately and I don't understand them as well. So I try to kind of stay in my lane. So I'll admit I do write for US audience, and most of my readers are from the US. The vast majority, over I think 90%, are from the US. I do think the principles can be applied elsewhere. I think, for example, the taxes chapter, thinking about taxes and timing and all those types of things. I don't exactly know the intricacies of the tax system in, let's say, India or Canada or Brazil or wherever else. But if you can think about what's the main principle here? It's about timing. Do you want to pay taxes now or later, and how you kind of make those trade-offs? And it's things like that, right? So as you said, I think the principles apply, but I agree. I am writing for a mostly US audience. And so there is that, especially the taxes chapter specifically, is a very US centric chapter. If there's something like that, you can skip that type of chapter. But for other things, I think most of the book is still applicable regardless of where you're located. I think there's just a handful of chapters that are very US specific, and there's no way around that, I think.
Yeah, I would want to reiterate that to the audience who's viewing this right now. Books such as these, they tend to be very localized in their nature, and that will be an error on your part, because if you do look at this book as, oh no, it's not meant for me, it's meant for somebody who's in the US, you will be doing injustice to the sound principles that are there in the book. So irrespective, and that's why I made the recommendation of the book. I loved it when it hit me and I read it, and I knew most of it, but it was just so wonderfully brought in together. And the way that everything weaved in, it was just really nice to read it. And as I said right in the beginning, this would be my inspiration to write one for a specific audience as well. So please don't dismiss it for the fact that it's written by somebody in the US, predominantly for somebody in the US. The principles apply anywhere, and it's the mental model that you should be taking away. Nick, the last question I have for you is, without doubt, my favorite chapter in the book was the last chapter, chapter 21, which is the most important asset. I have been a student of time for the longest time that I know. I think I do a good job of managing it. I speak about it actively, and I do tell often people who are very young that the biggest asset you have is time. So don't be impatient around that. I'd love to know at a personal level, how do you go through your day? What's your schedule like? Walk us through that so that we have a little appreciation of your life.
Yeah, so obviously every day is a little different. I know that's very cliche to say, but for example, if it's a work day, I will, get up. I usually start the day by going to the gym. That's what I do. I'm fasted, go work out after, because I always want to feel like I've accomplished something like every day. And so even if I do the gym, if the rest of the day kind of goes haywire, at least I got that out of the way. So I start the day by going to the gym, doing some sort of workout, weightlifting, whatever. Then I'll usually start working. Usually I'll come back home, shower up, whatever, do my, have my morning protein, everything. Then I start working, right? And then every day is different. If it's obviously Monday through Friday, I actually have a full-time job. I'm not just a full-time author. I do have a full-time job where I'm, helping build a wealth management firm here in New York City. So I'll be working on that, a bunch of different projects I'm working on, whether we're systematizing something, whether I'm working on stuff for our websites, whatever it is, helping with leads, etc. And then outside of that, I obviously eat throughout the day. There's nothing that fancy. I wish I could give you like some morning routine, some secret. There is no secret, right? And I usually write on the weekends. I generally try to write or at night, at night or on the weekends when I write. So I've been writing now on my blog for over 310 weeks now. So, I do it once a week. I have not missed a single week. So I either do it on the weekend or I do it one night during the week, and I'll just kind of write something up based on something I'm thinking about or whatever. So I think that's what's important here.
That's brilliant. The consistency is admirable. Wonderful. Mm-hmm. I have to ask you, what is the most undesirable part of your day?
Undesirable. I don't know. Maybe if it's a leg day like in the gym, I don't know. That's probably the best answer I can give you. Like, generally, I really enjoy my time. I really don't have any undesirable parts. Something like that. I like sleeping. I like reading. I like doing everything. So it's very rare where I have someone I'm like, oh my gosh, I hate doing this. I really do enjoy my life. I'm very blessed and fortunate. But yeah, I would just say leg day maybe if I have to give an answer.
No, I totally relate to that instantly, and that's why I laughed at that. Awesome, man. One last question before I let you go. And you don't have to give me accurate numbers, but just ballpark. Where is most of your money invested in right now?
Well, it's technically mostly in equities, but it's split between US and international. So I would say it's half-half. Yeah, if I had to pick like which asset class is the biggest, it's US stocks, because US stocks represent the largest portion of total global market capitalization of equities. But yeah, I would say like 70% of my investable wealth is in equities. That's probably split 50-50 between US and then international. And then I have some REITs. And then I have a bunch of smattering of a bunch of little things. I have some art. I have some crypto. Bunch of little things like that. Some private, very small private investments, a couple % of my net worth, nothing crazy, but most of it is in US stocks and international stocks. I believe in what I say. I'm talking about just keep buying. I don't want to get rich off of, all these private companies. I'm doing X with my private money. Or they're doing X with my money, and then I'm telling people to go buy US stocks or something. That's not my thing, right? Most of my stuff's in ETFs and index funds. And I actually don't, this apartment you see behind, besides the books, which are all mine here, this is all furnished. So I own very little things. Like 98% of my wealth is in financial securities. I have less than 2% in everything else I own, in terms of clothes, shoes, everything. So I have to, I write what I invest in.
That is awesome, man. I love that. That's a great point to end this conversation on. You speak and you live what you write, which is brilliant. Thank you so much, Nick. One, for writing the book. It really, really helps, and I'm sure it'll continue to help a lot of people. And two, for sparing time today and having a conversation with me.
Thank you. I appreciate your time as well.
All the best, Nick. इस बुक रिव्यू को स्पॉन्सर किया है कुकू एफएम ने, जो हिंदुस्तान का नंबर 1 वर्नैक्युलर ऑडियो प्लेटफॉर्म है। 19 से 25 अक्टूबर के बीच में कुकू एफएम की दिवाली सेल चल रही है, जहां आपको एनुअल प्लान पे 50% ऑफ मिल सकता है इफ यू अप्लाई द कोड Diwali50। यही नहीं, इसके साथ आप पा सकते हैं गाड़ियां, गोल्ड कॉइन्स, वाउचर्स और बहुत सारे और प्राइजेस। डिस्क्रिप्शन और पिन कमेंट में लिंक है फॉर यू टू गेट 50% ऑफ ऑन द दिवाली सेल ऑफ कुकू एफएम। ये दिवाली कामयाबी वाली। YouTube शॉर्ट्स के लिए एक डेडिकेटेड चैनल लॉन्च किया गया है, जिसपे आप सिर्फ वो 60 सेकंड के शॉर्ट्स देख सकते हैं। नो लॉन्ग फॉर्मेट कंटेंट टू कंफ्यूज यू, एंड होपफुली those 60 seconds will help you just as much as these long format videos do. सब्सक्राइब करिए, पिन कमेंट और डिस्क्रिप्शन में लिंक है टू द Warikoo शॉर्ट्स चैनल।